Okay.
You have to minimize that.
How is that?
There you go.
Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, so what I'm embarked to do and where I ended up is very fascinating. But today, what I'm going to present to you is that I am now proposing to the community of academicians as well as anyone that we have an opportunity here to build a theory on how to develop social enterprise driven systemic change, right? And so here we have a case that I think we can learn from that was developed starting in around 1866, right? That gives us lessons around social movement mobilization, how to utilize social networks, and how to utilize social enterprises all around bringing about systemic change for the issues, various issues that we all have. So this is going to be a case on this specific movement, but the lessons that we're trying to extract in the theory we're trying to build is essentially something that I think will be useful for anyone here. And so my first job here, if I can make this work, is that I'll do a brief introduction of who's this person, who's Ellen White. She's a very unrecognized individual, but surprisingly, in 2015, the Smithsonian Magazine, a very significant of the Smithsonian Institute, a very important organization in America, decided to do a bold move to develop a set of what they call the 100 most significant Americans of all time. And obviously, as you can see on this slide, a lot of these, let me move this for my folks here.
You can minimize it by pushing that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and then you can move it up to the top.
Okay, thank you. Technology. So as you can see in the magazine here, you had names that we expect, right? Michael Jackson, Martin Luther King Jr., Neil Armstrong, Madonna, Hillary Clinton, Abraham Lincoln, and Muhammad Ali, and many others. But along there came along this name that most people have no idea. And this magazine claims she's one of the 100 most significant Americans of all time. So out of this study, hopefully, this can actually illuminate why actually, even though people don't recognize her, she is one of the significant Americans of all time. One of the fun facts that I'll share is that we have the breakfast cereal industry because of this woman. She recruited, mentored John Harvey Kellogg, made him a doctor, then set him up in the first health institution that she set up in 1866. And then from there on, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg is now the Kellogg name is now a household name because Dr. John Harvey Kellogg was trying to tinker around with whole grains so that he can figure out how folks can eat more whole grains. That's how they invented breakfast cereal, and it was all through her influence. So what I'm going to be presenting here is that there's an organizational element of what she's doing. We now know even from the Blue Zones that her impact has been to influence a group in the United States that live 10 years longer than average Americans. And it's one of the 5, I believe, Blue Zones that exist. And it all stems from the writings of this person. The last thing I'll mention about her is that she's been identified as possibly the most prolific author, prolific American author of all time. She has left a rich set of 100,000 pages, right, of writings that she developed. Surprisingly, she had a 3rd grade education, and that was it. So now moving along to sort of share what I was studying here. What I will share with you falls in the phenomena of social movements that scholars have recognized should I say developed, or they are formulated within religious movement. A lot of times you have religious movements being drivers of social movements. So for example, Martin Luther King Jr. was himself a preacher, but he was essentially on the front lines of the civil rights movement. So this is an example of that. What I'll do is I'm going to do almost like a backward process because everybody knows that I'm a talker. But I think I'll start with, here's what we're talking about today. And then this is where this is how we came about to this. The conclusion of what I have to present to you is that I present to you a theory of action on how you bring about change on any issue. And that theory is basically a theory around what I'm calling institutional island. The institutional island essentially is basically, as I found in this study, that what Ellen White did was that she developed within a movement that for them to resolve the issue of health, you had to develop a set of organizations that deal with the issue at hand at every aspect of that issue. So in this case, because they were interested in health, you will notice right here they had a farm for food production, because you got to deal with the food element as well as you're dealing with health. You have to have essentially a lot of the food elements. You may need to convert them. So you had a food factory that is part of the mix, but you have to deal with the distribution from where you're producing it to folks in the community. But either you're going to distribute it through the food store, or you may distribute it as ready-made food in a restaurant. So this, especially in business, is what they call a vertically integrated, should I say, a vertically integrated supply chain. So if you're a car dealership, you're owning everything from the mine of the metal all the way to the car dealership. That's essentially what she's doing here. But while she's dealing with the food element, they're also, if you're dealing with health, you got to deal with a healthcare element. So you have the hospitals there, and right here there's a clinic that exists there. But then you got to educate both the folks that will be driving the work that you're dealing with, but you got to change public's consciousness around this. So you got both of the formal education around coming from the school, and you also have informal education to the public through a media company. Back in the day, they just said publishing. So today it could be any type of media. You talk about television, whatever. But basically, with the institutional island, the first step is that you are setting up a set of organizations that are working at the local level, and you're bridging them through collaboration so that they help each other build capacity. And what this would be essentially is a type of granometer type of embeddedness. So the economic activities of these entities are essentially embedded within social relations. So this is a network. The second step that you then do is that you then take that basic structure, basic design, and you now replicate it in multiple cities. So now you're doing this. So you're touching various communities around. So you're spreading, you're creating a virus. As one of my committee members, Elisa, observed, she's like, this looks like a virus, right? Back in the day. And so she sort of helped me figure out how to study this, because basically it's almost like a virus going viral. And so this is why, for example, in my research, I talk about using Richard Dawkins' his conceptualization of the meme. It's basically this idea was being transmitted from one group of people to another as a meme through a meme transmittal mechanism, right? And so you then set it up all throughout. And so what you see here on the right is an example where I look at actually the movement and I trace what they were doing across the United States. And turns out they actually were doing that replication across the United States in 10 regions. And here what you see was what they were doing in New England, right? They're covering Boston, covering Maine, covering New York, and those type of states. And the next slide here is you see the California institutional island. So they were doing that as well over there. So the idea is that that basic, let's call it a virus, was being replicated across the city. And through the Granometer perspective, it was basically economic actions being embedded in social relations. But the next step to that development is that you got to connect all of this through networks. So in this case, the way they did it was they developed a network governance approach where you had interlocking directorates. So in other words, what you had is that you had a board member of a school, right, who is also a board member of a hospital, and you would have a board member of a clinic who's a board member of a restaurant in the local community. But then you also do that across cities, across states, and even across countries. So ultimately, what you find here is that you have here at the center was their headquarters in General Conference. But through there, this was tracking 600 individuals, connecting 400 organizations between 1904 and 1908. And this is what they were doing. And in the language of sociology, what I think this is happening is that you have created all these local economies across the country or across the world, and then they're embedded from a Granometer perspective. The economic actions of those local economies is embedded in social relations. But at this point, I think what this is happening here is that this is the Poloni embeddedness, as far as I'm concerned, because what it is like you now have all these local economies, but you're now embedding them into a society of Adventists. So this was the classic challenge. I think that I'll talk about a little bit later about this issue of what Polanyi calls the great transformation. But one of the things that I want to mention before I go further is that part of what is interesting about this type of model is that, and my professors here will correct me, but it appears to resemble what it's basically designed around a structural equivalent set of organizations. And so what you have here, and I'm using here, this is actually a recent example in Zimbabwe that sort of shows what was happening. They have, okay, the top node there, the top entity there is the headquarters based in Washington, D.C. And then what you have here was the regional leadership center that was based in Zimbabwe. And they had basically sort of what they call the local conferences, which is their church units that are now sort of covering specific local areas. So they had 3 of the locals and one of the regionals. And then in 2015, they split the local into 6. So now you see how you almost have this very centralized structure here. But what they did was that they then split it again, right? Instead of maybe putting this under, of these 6, maybe creating 3 new ones, and then you have them under the already existing 6. What they're doing is that they continue to multiply their structure. And with research that folks like Steve Bagali has done, is that this type of structure allows you to grow significantly fast, it creates flexibility, and it helps you to manage the local needs with a special focus on what you have there. So essentially what this movement is trying to do here is that how to create a structure for ourselves that's agile, that is touching the local needs, but is connected on a global scale where we are working all together to build this. And out of this, let's see how my time is, right? Oh, it's not too bad. Okay. Now as my goal was to try to generalize this, because I think what I was finding was something that can be utilized in any context. It doesn't have to be health, and it doesn't have to be religion. So I basically got help from a sociologist, James Coleman. He developed what's called the Coleman's boat, right? How do you bring about change on a macro level? So, but trying to connect that intervention, that's the macro level, all the way to the outcome at the macro level is difficult. So he said you sort of break down your problem this way. And I think this sort of helps us come up with this institutional island. I think it answers this. The what there is basically you need to have a set of people who consciously realize have a major grievance, right? There is what Habermas calls, hey, there's a system colonizing the life world, right? And so in this case, the structures that were developing around health were overshadowing personal choices and cultural decisions and so many of these things. So there was a group, in this case, the Adventists, that sort of developed that issue. So in any case, folks have issues, they're feeling this around the environmental issues, they're feeling this around the education issues or poverty. So you're starting off with that element where you're developing that grievance. And so what you're doing there is essentially creating a pool of people. It's a society of sorts. And the way I think about it from an engineering standpoint is if you're trying to construct something in the ocean, you're essentially creating the rock bed. That will be the foundation to lock in the structures you're going to set up. And so once you do that, you got to then create a messaging mechanism to basically continue to recruit people, assign roles to them so that they can identify and take a position. Where are they going to be in this movement? And once you then create that, now you get into the point where you have the kind of local embeddedness where the actions of people at the local level, they are now related, they're connected through a network, but then you then build them up by connecting them through networks as well, so that they can continue working at a grander problem for what they're dealing with. I will come here and mention here that part of my attempt to make this a generalizable theory was to provide what I call 15 propositions to try to, how do you develop this, right, from beginning to end, where you start off with the grievance that you're dealing with, to mobilizing and recruiting your folks out to the ultimate end where you are essentially having systemic change. So this is an example of one of the 15 here, where you basically have the idea of, if you have a leader who has a larger than life mission, hey, we need to do something about this ever challenging issue of homelessness, right? Then you combine that with, the leader has a confidence in a person that they're recruiting, and then there's a consistent messaging as well, tapping into the recruit's commitment to this same issue. The the prediction that I'm sharing here is then you may have higher levels of recruitment internalizing the leader's mission. So this is sort of my attempt to sort of say, can we look at all the different components and develop basically a theory building up through these 15 propositions to say, okay, for any issue, you can go and test that are these actually the processes at play to actually bring about this change. All right, and looking at my time, let me go ahead and move forward. Again, the 15 proposition here, the first three deal with role formation. The next set is group formation. The next set is organizational collaboration and so forth. So that sort of gives you a glimpse on what that is about. Now, I wanted to go ahead and jump on here, right? Because I think I've discussed those slides earlier. But what I wanted to mention here is an implication that I didn't even expect, but I think became very clear by the time I finished this, to say, okay, what Ellen White and her movement are doing is they're addressing health. But it seems that actually what they were dealing with was actually they were dealing with a significantly bigger problem. And I think the health issue was just the experiment to actually deal with that specific issue. And I think it's the issue that these major theorists came up with, and they're consistent on this thing. The idea that modern economy changed the way we operate, maybe starting in the 1700s. And when that change happened, it created a situation, Keynes is the first person here talking about from an economic lens. He says that the modern economy is basically inherently going to be creating great inequalities of wealth, right? And multiple crises. From his standpoint, the way you deal with that is state intervention, right? So that's his way. Polanyi is also dealing and talking about the same thing when he talks about the great transformation. He said there's been a great transformation that's created what he called double movements. The first movement was this issue of disembedding the economy from society, right? And so he said basically that disembedding of the economy from society has created and will create and continue to create all these multiple crises, right? And so that's what he's saying. But he said that the other movement that's going to happen is that this reactionary approach to say, how do you deal with it? And a big reaction to that was, for example, the trade unions that existed, the labor movements and so on and so on, to deal with a lot of the challenges and crises that were developing through this I'll call new experiment of intervention of how we should govern society that started emerging around the 1700s. And the last one is Habermas, who sort of looks at the same issue, and in his language, he's talking about the colonization through the system, and then he says there's a reaction that will come through lifestyle movements. So to me, I'm looking at these folks and they're saying there is a specific structural change in society that happened in modern society, and that will build multiple crises. And what I see fascinating is this next slide. Obviously, on the right side, you have Ellen White, born in 1827. Karl Marx was 9 years old, 9 years older than Ellen White, okay? He's the founder of socialism and communism. The next person, Georges Sorel, I think is French. He's 20 years younger than Ellen White. He essentially is the writer that influenced fascism, that gave us fascist Italy and Germany. Then the next person, Richard Tilley, is a person I didn't know. He's the founder. Richard Eli, thank you, my wife, right? She always corrects me. I would always call him Tilley, but he's Eli, right? He's the founder of the American Economic Association, the most significant, most powerful body for economists in the world, right? And he personally influenced President Woodrow Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, as well as FDR. And he's dealing, I think, what I would try to make a case is that these four contemporaries are essentially developing an experiment to say, how do you fix this grand experiment that happened in modern society? And so when you look at here, Karl Marx, the way he says, how do you re-embed society how do you re-embed economy back into society, is that you do that by communism and socialism. But here's the thing, we got to overthrow the state to do that, right? And we need a violent revolution, right? But with George Sorel, he's saying, okay, we use fascism, we overstake the state. The state is our instrument for us to bring about that change, and we use a paramilitary violence to capture the state so that we can now control the economy and re-embed the economy back into society. Richard Tilley he is the father of progressive economics, right, here in the United States. And the New Deal, essentially, the American New Deal comes out of him. And the idea of essentially reforming the state. So with them, they believe that you reform the state, make interventions through the state into the economy to now re-embed the economy into society. I think Ellen White, what she's doing is essentially proposing an experiment to do that in a very different way. In her case, it's like we will use what I'm calling institutional island economies, and we will reform. We will not, unlike the other ones, it's either you overthrow the state or you overtake the state to bring about change in society, especially that relationship within the economy and the society. In her case, it's almost like we reform the society to ultimately reform the state. And just like Richard Tilley, those are the two that are nonviolent. But what's interesting here is that, well, my committee here, let me move this thing here out of the way, is the way they approach the state. Karl Marx was anti-state. Ultimately, we need to get rid of it. Judge Searle was like into the state. Let's take it over. Then let's use it for a benefit. Even the labor unions will not let them be organic. We'll control them, right? Richard Tilley is into state, and the ways you get involved into politics to take over the structures, you also. It is during this time that the Federal Reserve Bank, for example, was instituted, right, to essentially bring in those government-based interventions. And then in the Ellen White case, it's very interesting. It's in spite of the state. We're going to do what we do at the grassroots level, build an economy where we re-embed the economy back into society. But obviously, this is advantageous. These two are advantageous because they're non-revolutionary, they're non-violent. But both of them are significantly slower than these ones. And you take forever to get power, even with this one, but this one is crazily slow. So there's the advantages and disadvantages of this, you can see them. And so what is fascinating here is, I can take hold of my thing here, is that what we have today is a situation was one of the experiments, essentially by 1989, the first one, once the Soviet Union collapsed, is somewhat, we could say, now sort of generally disregarded, right? There's attempts to rebuild it, but the most powerful exemplar of that example basically was shattered somewhat in 1989. Obviously, Nazi Germany, as well as Mussolini Italy, by 1945. That experiment was pretty shattered. There was resemblance of it in Japan as well. Obviously, sorry for the committee, I don't know what's up with this ribbon, let's take it over there, is that this is the currently functioning experiment in America. And obviously, if it's in America, that is a currently functioning state. The Bretton Woods institutions essentially was an inspiration out of Richard Tilley. So the idea of the IMF and the World Bank and so on and so on, both you have the national-based interventions happening here with the Federal Reserve Bank and other policies, but as well as a global level. So you can imagine right now this is an experiment that's happening. But what I would say is that this is sort of a side little show here, a side little experiment that's just been demonstrated within an environment. And I think that was really what was the core of what was happening at this time. And so it was, I think, ultimately the idea of we have, I believe, modern day, the ideas of all of these were approaches to try to re-embed economy into society. And I think ultimately the biggest finding that I'm getting is that there's a consistent recognition by these founders and others that there's a significant structural challenge. So whether these are the last experiments or not, but I think one of the findings that I get is that ultimately when we look at the issue at hand, we need to think about how do we deal with that specific issue of re-embedding the economy. And then I will now say, sorry, I'm going to move this again, right? So it turns out that the breaking news here is that my research questions were essentially to try to find the structures and mechanisms and processes to bring about systemic change using social enterprises. But it so happens, I think what they've also become, they are now research questions as well, to identify structures and mechanisms and processes to develop how you build a grassroots-based way to re-embed the economy using a social movement approach, using social networks, as well as using social enterprises, right? And what else, like I said, I spin things around. So the way I had designed my study to get at that is I basically had three phases. One was a qualitative text analysis to essentially get at the what I'll phrase it as what looked like the manifesto, right, of Ellen White to say this is how do you deploy the structures and the processes. So out of that, what I was doing what scholars call using text as a proxy of experience. So you're essentially extracting out of that those texts to see what was the experience that was happening at the time. And I was identifying, number one, the structures. And by the structures here, the first set of structures that I was bringing coming out was the organizations, right? And then I was looking at the processes of collaboration. And then I did a next phase of essentially developing a social network analysis where I converted those first set of structures and processes into matrices to then visualize them. And then the last part was then I did a study of 600 leaders of the Adventist movement who connected 400 organizations to see how they interlocked their boards between 1904 to 1908. And obviously, this is the approach. What I was using here is what we call mixed methods social network analysis, right? And so ultimately, the key finding here is that the structures of Adventist the health reform movement comprised of the family, the religion, right? So they were using this. And obviously, if somebody's looking at generalizing it, a key element essentially to say, what else can replace this aspect, right? In my mind, just if my proposition is that people they gravitate towards religious leaders, but I see that same type of mechanism, similar type of mechanism happening with political party leaders. And I also see it happening with celebrities. So those are like, those are other realms of society that I wonder could also replace the religion aspect. But obviously, I think what's core is you want to develop social enterprises that deal with the core issue at hand. Then you want to have local networks. So that's also a structure. But then you also have a global structure to now re-embed that economy into a society. And obviously, I mentioned these were the examples, the enterprises. This will sort of show you an example of how I extracted the process. So in this case, in the writings, she's talking about how they left Los Angeles. They went to San Diego and they found that there was a restaurant and a food store and a treatment that were working in the best part of the city. And if I can move this, right? And the work was carried on in rooms once used as a saloon. So really what is really happening here is these three entities are sharing infrastructure. So there's a collaboration around infrastructure. So in this case, I was basically capturing this as basically, hey, the restaurant is sharing infrastructure with the store and with the clinic, but because it's essentially really two-way, so I'm to basically then visualize it, which I will show you soon, is basically I would also do that same thing for, hey, stores sharing with the restaurant, stores sharing with the clinic. All right, and in this next one, let's see, I'm looking at my time here. This is an example where basically the food factory is supporting the school. So essentially here, the idea is that let's set up schools. These schools will need to be sustained by the starting of various industry, which included the food factory. So in this case, there's an element of corporate social responsibility partnership. So there's a profit sharing to sustain the school. So that was the collaboration. So what I was doing was to grab all these various type of collaborations. So what they did is what I then did was to then map them out into these matrix to sort of say, hey, for example, you have the factories basically, the factories providing 40 various sets of economic resources to the church, or the hospital is providing 3 to the publisher. And out of that, right, I was able to do some measures on what we call degree centrality. Basically, who is this key player, who's central in various ways? Who's, in this case, who is giving out in degree, in out degree, who's giving out more resources, right? And who's receiving more resources in degree. But and so I looked at those measures. Because of my time, I will skip them. But in this case, when you map it out through social network analysis, right, I was able to develop this structure to show how those collaborations happen across those organizations in a visual way, right? The key lesson here is the idea of this collaboration. The collaboration builds capacity across these entities. Like, for example, the mission of the church, to serve the Adventist church, was to transform health. but the church cannot perform surgeries, right? So basically, you need essentially an entity called the hospital that can actually do that, and then you can actually reach out, reach your intended goal on that aspect of healthcare provision, right? In this case, I was just breaking apart the different types of capitals, and I'll go ahead and skip those. So, but basically, it sort of shows you there were cultural capitals, and I think 22 minutes. I think I will stop here for questions. But I appreciate everybody here. Hopefully, please feel free to share your questions so that I can clarify. I know I was zooming through because of the amount of material, but hopefully through the questions I could clarify.
Thank you, Rodney. That was very impressive for you to be within the time period. I'm very impressed.
I got training for Dr. Alaisa and Dr. Masarira. They helped.
Wonderful. All right, so we're going to open it up to folks that are on Zoom and any visitors here in the room. If anybody has a question, you can enter it into the chat, or you could raise your hand or come off mute and ask your question, or leave a comment.
Oh, Dr. Sarira has a question.
Go ahead. Thank you, Rodney. Well done. Excellent work.
Thank you.
My question is very simple. I don't know if there's a simple answer to it. What could be a driver? I'm thinking the Ellen White and the movement was from 1870s. Now we're in 2026.
Right.
And it has sustained itself for so long because there is a driver, which could be religion. If we take out religion, what else could be a driver? I know you spoke about
Politics.
Politics, yeah. Could government be that driver? That's the only thing I could think of. I'm just throwing this thing here. The one which can sustain in the long haul.
I'll give my attempt to an answer. My thinking is that the government somebody needs to drive the government. So who is that, right? So I think whether it's religion, politics, celebrity folks, I think the government, in my thinking, will be more of a structure that will be, because ultimately the government is not a runaway train. So somebody is determining what are the policies that are prioritized and what are not, right? What I'm thinking, for example, actually, no, I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to thank Dan Buettner and his team of Blue Zones, right? In that case, right, you just have, I'm not sure what his drive is, but Dan Buettner, for example, who's been instrumental with the Blue Zones project, he's actually a type of that driver, right? And fortunately for him, I found out recently, his son is also Dan Buettner, and he's also involved in this. So you almost see this cross-generational element. But a lot of times the work that we're looking at will cross generations. So I don't know how you sustain that. So there's got to be something within the Buettner family that they were used to drive that. But I think that's my attempt to answer that, and hopefully that becomes the contribution of everyone to say, okay, what are some of those key social drivers that really allow persistent social structures to cross generations, geographies, and time. Yeah, that's my. Sorry, I don't have a greater answer, but that's my best attempt. Was that just? Yes, was that? Thank you for coming, by the way.
Hey, great job, Rodney. Excellent, excellent. You had a slide where you talked about who gets more, like the church gives out more and gets in more. Can you go back to that slide?
Right. It's right here. Yes.
I think there was another one also. In and out. There was an in.
Oh, okay, it's this one. Yes, this one.
Yes, out degree and in degree.
Right.
What is that last column?
Oh, Okay. Oh, you just put me on spot. Okay, so let's see. So my professors here, I'm gonna chest if I was listening in class, especially Lisa. All right, so my understanding, eigenvector is essentially, so most of these measures of who's important in the center of things, right? But the way you're measuring it is you're measuring at the person. So you say, okay, hey, how many politicians does Rodney know? How many funders does Rodney know, and so forth. So you're looking at there, and how many people are getting money from Rodney, and how many people are giving money to Rodney. But it's all sort of looking and measuring it right at Rodney's standpoint. Eigenvector, my understanding of it is that it's trying to see, okay, how powerful are you, and how powerful are the people you are around, right? So I might be a wealthy person. I might have some few dollars that I'm doing things with. But if I'm playing with folks who don't have any money, right, my circle is a little weak. So I'm sort of weakened by that. So I don't know. Did I do a good job? Okay. Looks like I need to go
No,
correct my
you got the main idea.
She said I got the main idea. So
Usually you,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you.
to answer your question, usually when you think of it, it's instead of the weakness,
It's-
a lot of eigenvector centrality, even if I don't have a lot of money, if I'm connected to and have influence over a few people who do, I still have a lot of power. Because even though I'm not giving it out, I'm closely connected to those people who do. And so sometimes your power is not something, it's not about your direct exchanges with people, which is what in degree and out degree measure. They measure your activity, but sometimes you could be somewhat inactive. If the people around you are active, you still sort of get credit for that. And eigenvector centrality is a measure that picks up that sort of adjacent to activity element. If that made sense.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it did. It did. Absolutely. And actually, what I was thinking of was that, to be
Thank
honest,
you. Thank
I
you.
want to disclose the private facts in your life, but actually, I think you represent exactly the example she's talking about. And you and I, we know your networks, and so you know how far you're able to reach because of your network. So I think you're a classic example of what she's describing.
Thank you.
No,
Sorry.
I'll just chime in, if it's okay, with a comment. So Rodney, thank you so much for the opportunity to sit in. My name is Lindsay Wan. I serve as the executive director of the Sprouts Healthy Communities Foundation. And the comment that I wanted to make is more on, what we're seeing here in this research is the power of these networks and how they not only exist in particular communities, but actually, especially today, what I wonder is when I look at Rodney's research and what's been presented, how that translates to today's moment. And when you're working across the country or different areas of issue that are across today, even the virtual world, these dynamics, all have a hold in change that's being made. So, particularly in some of the areas where Rodney and I have overlap, food systems, nonprofit, for-profit, social change. So it's really exciting to see, the roots of some of this. So it's been very informative. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Lindsay. I wanted to just add to what you just described there. It's been part of why I've been, and most of you know, is that my PhD journey has taken longer, but I've been very active in the community. And part of why I've been very excited to be part of, for example, places like Spaces of Opportunity, I've had a great time working with folks like Roseanne with her leadership and so forth, is essentially these, it's one thing to read things in the books, but it's another thing to see it on the ground, right? So I was always describing when folks ask me and say, for example, Spaces of Opportunity, where Lindsay is a key leader there, essentially does that, right? For example, the land is the 20 acre or so land there is owned by the Roosevelt School District. But then the Sprouts Foundation, Desert Botanical Gardens, Orchard Learning, earlier on Tiger Mountain, I think Dr. M, I saw her there with unlimited potential, right? They brought in capacity in different areas, right? Ground game, resources, and so forth. So it's to me, that's actually the exciting and inspiring, and it fills my hope for the future, because I see these networks at play even to this very day. Roseanne, for example, I can imagine, I think of the data she has in terms of if somebody was to go in, if a lawyer was going to say, do a second PhD, I could go to Roseanne and look at all the relationships that she's built with all the networks she's influencing. So I'm excited that this is still happening today. I think, hi, Chris.
Hey, Rodney, how you doing?
Oh, yeah, how are you? I think your volume is a little low.
Oh, sorry about that. I just wanted to ask real quick, and it was a great presentation. I really got a lot out of it. And in your four models, or the basically the people that you had there, that you were doing the comparison in, of the four social models, what, in your opinion, which model produces the great social value, that, and what as far as outcomes and their history? And I noticed you can see the first two were more or less kind of failures, but I mean, is there any way to gauge the value that came out of the four?
Yeah, I think so. I think I think of your question. So in case, I'll sort of repeat it. The idea is, how do you, for the two models that are remaining, or at least that are remaining that I am aware of, right, is how do you gauge and compare their impacts? And I think the impact, I would say, number one, there's two ways to measure it, right? I think I'll start with the second part, which I think, well, let me finish with that. Actually, let me start with the other one. I think we have ways to actually measure and a lot of that impact. And I think, for example, hopefully, part of it is what I do in my chapter, or for the fourth one, I do that in my second chapter in my dissertation, to look at all the work that's done. And some of the measuring is what, for example, the Blue Zones have done, right? So the impacts of those things. With the third model, I think there's been a significant amount of measurements around that model, right? So for the classic gross domestic product measures, right? The classic issues about how maybe even literacy measures, the issues, even some of the policies around, like I know Jesse's online, there's a lot of the double up food boxes, SNAP provisions. So a lot of that resource that's coming from the third factor is trying to essentially get at dealing with issues around access to food, maybe access to homelessness. So I think, number one, I think there's a lot of measures. I think really, first of all, currently, when it comes to magnitude, I would guess, this is my guess, I would guess that from a quantitative measure, I would guess the third one is by far ahead, because ultimately it's running economies, right? It's running the United States especially. So the amount of work that they've already done is pretty significant. Whereas the fourth one, I mean, it's never really been implemented, as far as I know, to really run a nation. You see, the first and the second one, they've run nations. Germany, they've run Soviet Union, but the third one hasn't. So I think just immediately, I think in terms of comparison, that one doesn't have the measures to compare with the third one. But I think the other ways to also think about impact has to do with time. Right, because I think there's an issue of sustainability over time. So a solution can come in, right? But is that solution permanent? We did some work with Lori, and Lori always reminds me of this. She has a phrase that she says, with the work of food banks, there's the issue of feeding the line or ending the line, right? And so the idea is you can continue feeding folks on the line, right? But the impact there, you're not getting to the grassroots. So with the grassroots, part of it is there's a time factor. So ultimately, that is work that to be honest, I haven't looked at that. And I think obviously, first of all, folks, that's where I was talking to Dr. Masarira. I think one of the ways that I think some of the group of folks that I think will help to improve this work going forward are engineers, right? And then because there's a lot of designs as well, structuring around, for example, the networks on the fourth one, and then ultimately trying to measure that over time and trying to see what's this, which one is most sustainable. I think to me, the sustainability question is going to be a very important question because solutions can come. Like, I think that's what we learned from the first and the second, right? Folks who were part of those movements, I think a lot of them were probably satisfied with what was happening, but the structures were not able to sustain themselves over time. I think that became the challenge. And I think people still today may be very interested in the first and maybe second too, right? But I wonder, but the question still is, even if you re-implement the first one, for example, then how do you sustain it over time? And so I think that's the other measure of that. But long story short, my answer is that I think I haven't measured myself, but there's enough, I think, information there to give us that the third one is by far has already had traction in terms of bigger impacts.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Watson. There's one on Watson.
Oh, hello, Watson. How are you? Oh no, I was trying to figure out who this is. Oh, Dr. Virini, how are you? Right?
I'm doing well, and congratulations, Brother Rodney, for the work that you have done following proceedings from Harare, Zimbabwe. Great presentation, and as a pastor in the Seventh-day Adventist Church and as a professor also, I'm really blown away by the work that you have done because we usually read the writings of Ellen G. White from the perspective of accessing spiritual and moral instruction and direction, but you have come in from a different angle, which is socio-economic, and bringing a totally new perspective. I believe, I looked at your work yesterday. I believe that there's great potential that comes out of this work, or great value that comes out of this work. And my only question that I have, having looked at, you presented in one of the slides, some of Ellen White's contemporaries who were like social innovators. That's not the term you used, but that's my own term. Would it be fair to characterize Ellen White's approach as a macro approach, whereas the micro approach, whereas the others were looking at society at large and trying to bring about change, or proffering, methodologies or approaches that would bring change on a wider scale, whereas Ellen White's approach is beginning with the individual and their commitment, spiritual commitment in that religious faith community that she's functioning in. Would it be fair to characterize that there's a difference between her approach and the approaches of her contemporaries, the macro and micro, approaches? Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. In my dissertation, I actually used the word grassroots to actually highlight what you're describing. And I also try to capture that in this proposition, that this is the kind of work that I'm seeing. It's having to start at the local in terms of actually building that infrastructure, that economic infrastructure. So that is a significant difference, which is bringing both strengths but weaknesses as well. So for strengths, for example, obviously, I think what it does as a design, it allows more people to have ways to be involved, right? So you don't have to be wealthy or powerful or so forth to both be part of it or even to launch this type of design, right? But the weakness is also that that means it starts off inherently weak, right? And so ultimately you now have to build this consent across multiple individuals who have diverse understanding and backgrounds and so forth and so on. So that also comes with weaknesses, but ultimately, the way you characterize it, I wish I had those same words. Absolutely, that's exactly a key difference here with both of those models. Well, actually, with that third, it's actually a difference from that. Actually, one way to even to highlight that, what was shocking and surprising to me is Ellen White had only the third grade education because of the accident she had when a girl hit her face. So she never finished elementary education, let alone college, right? But if you look at, for example, I was fascinated at how I never read it, but I was fascinated at I always thought Karl Marx was just a regular person, but he was a deep scholar, right? I mean, he was right. I mean, you probably I see why you're laughing because I didn't realize that he had studied like he was a powerful brain. So was Richard Ely as well as George Sorrell. So in terms of that, even from just the personal traits of the folks who start this, right, it's also representing the nature of the designs, right? Because it's really the other three really take very sophisticated, real well accomplished scholars to develop. Whereas this one is basically, as far as concerned, a woman who was just a church member, right? And so there's that, but it's as I mentioned, there's these strengths and weaknesses that are coming out of that model.
Thank
So-
you.
Thank you all for your wonderful questions and for supporting Rodney and being at this presentation. This ends the public portion of the defense. So I'm going to ask you all to sign off, and then the committee will meet with Rodney and continue. So thanks again, everyone.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Excellent, Rodney. Excellent.